I mean, it is incredible to think that a year ago this week was when Trump won with the popular vote in every single swing state. And a year later, you have a self-described democratic socialist. And just to be clear, it's not 1 in 4 of Mamdani voters who describe themselves as democratic socialists. 1 in 4 New York City voters who participated in the mayoral election, according to exit polls, consider themselves democratic socialists. A year ago, Trump was announcing that this will truly be the golden age of America. We're going to unlock America's glorious destiny. We're going to achieve the most incredible future for our people. America's future will be bigger, better, bolder, richer, safer, and stronger than it has ever been before. Today, the country is teetering on the brink of an economic catastrophe that could rival the Great Depression. That's not an exaggeration. That's not me saying that. That is the strategists of the ruling class who are making these warnings. A year ago, this week, Trump was saying, we are days away from the best jobs, the biggest paychecks, and the brightest economic future the world has ever seen. Since Trump uttered those words, you've had the lowest job creation since the depths of the Great Recession. 3 days ago, the Washington Post ran a headline saying, layoffs rise to recession-like levels through October, with US employers announcing 1.1 million job cuts so far this year. Wall Street Journal on Friday, consumer sentiment sinks to near record low. He also said, we're going to end forever wars. On election night, he said, my proudest legacy will be that of a peacemaker. In the year that followed, he carried out the largest attack by the United States in modern history on Iran. His so-called peace deal in Gaza is a sickening mockery of the rights of the Palestinian people. I don't know what peace anyone is talking about. Israel has killed or wounded at least 836 Palestinians since the ceasefire took effect last month. Not to mention the hundreds of attacks that are constantly taking place in the West Bank. Or earlier this week, Israel's heavy aerial bombardment campaign of southern Lebanon. There is no peace in the Middle East. The Ukraine war, which Trump pledged to stop in one day, he's actually done next to nothing to change course from Biden. Okay, he has the Europeans paying for their own weapons, but he has not backed off from this war that the West started and the West is losing. Last month, the Pentagon authorized sending long-range Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine. And that was last month. Last week, Trump ordered the first nuclear weapons testing since 1992. After all the talks and all the summits and all these negotiations and zigzags, he hasn't pulled away from this proxy war. Now he's bombing unidentified civilians every day in the Caribbean. He's gambling with another war. You have the biggest military buildup since the invasion of Panama in 1989. He said, on election night, we're going to heal this country. We're going to fix everything about our country. Meanwhile, he's now made a record with beating his last record, the longest ongoing government shutdown in history. There are 42 million SNAP recipients who are figuring out if they're going to make it to the end of the month or not, if they're going to be able to feed their families. They're being denied food stamps according to the latest decision by the Supreme Court. They might receive a partial payment. That's 1 in 8 people in the United States. That includes 16 million children. There are hundreds of thousands of federal workers who have gone without multiple paychecks now. They're trying to figure out how to keep their lives together. The FAA administrator said last week between 20 and 40% of air traffic controllers are not showing up for work on any given day. It's kind of a scary thought. In terms of the disruption to flights, since Tuesday there have been 38,000 delays of flights in the United States. Since we started this school on Friday, there have been nearly 5,000 canceled flights across the US. My fingers are crossed for the comrades that had to fly into town. The transportation secretary said the US has a shortage of around 3,000 air traffic controllers at the moment. All of this is just a glimpse into 1 year of Trump's so-called golden age. We're not in the least bit surprised by the way this time period has played out. Here's what we said 1 year ago on the article we published the day after the election. Trump has overpromised, and given the crisis of the system, he will be forced to underdeliver. In fact, if implemented, many of his proposals, such as mass deportations and sky-high tariffs, will only exacerbate the problems, and millions will end up with buyer's remorse. A lack of concrete and lasting results will lead to disappointment and a renewed search for even more radical solutions. Eventually, the class questions will come clearly to the fore, and the pendulum will swing decisively to the left. This is what we said right after the election. He now has the lowest approval rating of his second term. It's been reported that he has the lowest approval rating for this point in a presidential administration in the last 80 years. He's underwater in his ratings in 12 states that he won last year, including every single swing state. And of course, you have the Zoran Mamdani electoral victory, also confirming what we said, that the working class discontent, that anger in society was not a sign of a rightward shift. It was a distorted expression of class anger that was trying to find an outlet in the absence of a mass working class party. They were looking for a way to fight back against the status quo, to reject the establishment. A year ago this week, the liberal press was full of pessimism, doom and gloom and introspection about how every single demographic had shifted to the right. We said, no, this country's not moving to the right. This is a vote against the Democratic Party and the conditions of the last 4 years, and the Democrats have actually earned this result. This was a response to the worst inflation in 40 years. And it wasn't just the last 4 years, it was a response to the fact that the Democrats had ruled for 12 out of the previous 16 years. Most of the 2008 aftermath was overseen by Democrats. They've become associated with that period of sharp decline that came after 2008. Trump won 80% of voters who said that the economy was their main worry. And because at the same time, the Democrats were campaigning on saying the economy is doing great. Bidenomics is working. And for some, it was working. One of the few segments to swing towards Kamala Harris was voters who make more than $100,000 a year. Harris won 91% of voters who said the economy is excellent or good. Of course, she got more billionaires. She also got more than 700 current and former national security officials, including the late war criminal Dick Cheney, who endorsed Kamala Harris. And of course, Biden had spent hundreds of billions of dollars on the wars in Ukraine and Israel. It was Biden who pushed Ukraine into that war with Russia, promising Zelensky that NATO membership was on the table for Ukraine as part of a plan to weaken Russia. It was Biden who went and embraced Netanyahu and gave him the blank check for his genocide in the first place. It was Biden who oversaw the brutal repression of the student encampments across the country. This was all at the forefront of people's minds by the millions when they went to cast a vote a year ago. Not necessarily because they believed the outlandish claims and promises that Trump was making, but because they were desperate for a change. And when Kamala Harris was asked on the eve of the election in an interview, what, if anything, would you have done differently in the last 4 years? Her response was, not a thing comes to mind. Today, despite everything, as unpopular as Trump is, as unhappy as people are with the direction of the country and the state of the economy, the Democrats are still at an all-time low in their popularity. They're rejected by 2/3 of the US population. The largest poll that was taken last month was by CBS News. It's confirmed by all the polls. There's constant polling. You can go to Real Clear Politics and see these. The largest one was CBS News last month. It gave the Democrats 34% approval, 66% disapproval, a negative 32-point spread. Now, for those of you who were in the party a year ago in election season, you'll remember that we conducted the Class War 2024 campaign. We hit the streets for some recruitments, talking to people. We did our share of door knocking as well, with a message that the working class needs its own party, that workers should reject both capitalist parties. We were fighting against lesser evilism, fighting for class independence, and we explained that if the labor movement were to break away and form a mass working class party of its own, it would completely turn the tables on Trump and the Democrats and would provide finally a genuine class struggle outlet for that deep-seated anger across the country. And that is still our position today. Now, one conclusion we can draw from looking at Zoran Mamdani's campaign is just how suddenly a new force can emerge and gain momentum almost out of nowhere. when it connects with the mood. This was 9 months ago that he was polling at 1%, and basically nobody knew about him. His campaign, of course, accumulated 104,000 volunteers. They've knocked on 3 million doors. They made 4.4 million phone calls. Among the people that the campaign interacted with at doorsteps or on the phone, nearly 15,000 volunteered on the spot to actively participate in the campaign and help canvass or phone bank. They held 57,000 canvassing sessions in 243 neighborhoods. Now, all of this was a huge effort by 100,000 plus people. This was led by a backbone of volunteers of 700 field organizers who each committed to taking one shift per week. In essence, we're talking about a sort of cadre structure, able to mobilize a much larger force. For every field organizer, they were able to coordinate 150 campaign volunteers. And what were they putting forward? Obviously, minimal bread and butter demands about cost of living. But just imagine if those 3 million conversations at doorsteps, those 4.4 million phone calls, had actually been making a systematic case to break with the Democrats and Republicans, saying the billionaires have both of those parties under their control. We need a party of our own. You can just imagine the impact it would have made, not on New York City, not only on this election, but across the country. Instead of Zoran making those videos on Instagram and TikTok saying, stop sending us money, because they reached the limit that was set by the campaign finance laws, imagine if they were just systematically building up a war chest for an independent fighting force, trying to raise as much money as possible from the working class to build something that was able to fight back. Not just a ballot line, not just an electoral vehicle, but a fighting proletarian party capable of mobilizing mass action, strikes, pickets, workers' assemblies, workplace action committees, mass demonstrations. In today's environment, you could contemplate the possibility, given that kind of operation, of a general strike in this country. You can see that the willingness is there. There were 7 million people that came out into the streets last month for the No Kings protest. And of course, it was given liberal leadership, but it shows a desire to mobilize, to act. There was 250,000 in Chicago alone. Now we see that MAGA is fracturing, but that discontent needs somewhere to go. Those illusions in Trumpism, they are being undermined, but at the same time, the Democrats are rubbing their hands together, hoping that they're going to profit from this in the midterms. They're trying to capture this energy. Kathy Hochul said it herself. She went to Zoran's big blowout rally at the end of the campaign. When she addressed the crowd, they drowned her out with chants of, tax the rich, tax the... She finally had to calm them down. I hear you, I hear you. Later, she told journalists who asked her, are you going to actually tax the rich? She said, just because of that rally? No. She said, I didn't even know what they were saying. She did say, I found their energy refreshing. I want to bottle it up and use it in the midterms. This is the way that the Democrats are looking at what this represents. A year into Trump 2.0, there is no less anger than there was a year ago. None of those sources of working class discontent have been relieved. If anything, they've all intensified. Now think, in Trump's first term, I think he actually got very lucky. The timing of the crisis aligning with the pandemic allowed him to make an excuse that I think a lot of his voters bought, that this was just an uncontrollable circumstance, this is an act of nature, and it allowed him to offload responsibility for that really severe economic crisis of 2020 that came with it. Now, of course, you could have had the end of MAGA after the first term. Of course, Trump's always going to find a way to divert the blame. The question is, how long do people buy it? When does the patience of his voters run out? How long until we reach the critical point where MAGA's fracturing actually, quantity becomes quality? If you look back to the way this year started, he started out with an aggressive display of political fireworks. This was flooding the zone, remember, with all these executive orders. If you remember in the lead up to the election, he was saying, I'm going to be a dictator on day one. What was he talking about? He had this big stack of executive orders, and he was gleefully ready to go and sign them all and flood the zone. And the liberals were thrown into panic, and the courts were suddenly swamped, and they were having a hard time making sense of it. They were talking about Project 2025, creating this blueprint for a dictatorship. And we analyzed this at the time. Our article holds up. I recommend comrades go back and read our analysis on communistusa.org about Project 2025. We said, this is not a blueprint for a dictatorship. This is an eclectic hodgepodge. these people are not on the same page. They had two different views on trade. Some of them are arguing for free trade, some for protectionism. They had three different opinions about the Ukraine war. Some saying support Ukraine, some saying pull out, some saying support them a little bit less. They had 10 different views about what to do with the unions. Some saying let's take on the unions, we need to crush them. Others saying we need to win over the unions. They were on totally different pages. But at the time, it looked like Trump was doing a lot. Actually, polls were showing early on in his term that his voters were impressed by this level of activity. All the daily press conferences, new headlines every day about some new initiative. Elon Musk was in the Oval Office doing God knows what every day. And Trump was giving off this impression of calmness and confidence. It looked like he was advancing, and people were worried about that. Comrades, that is not the impression you get from the Oval Office these days. That is gone. This past Wednesday, the morning after the election, Trump gathered Senate Republicans in the White House for a discussion. He said, after the press leaves, I want to talk about what last night represented and what we should do about it, and also about the shutdown and how that relates to last night. He's acknowledging that the shutdown is hurting the Republicans. Senator Josh Hawley is one of these far-right, sort of populist MAGA figures. Later that day, he was there at the meeting. He went to Steve Bannon's podcast, and he reported what that little chat was about. In his words, Trump said, if we don't deliver for these people, we're going to see more Mamdanis. We're going to see more socialists and communists out there taking control because working people need champions, and they need help right now. We need to get their jobs back. We need to get their wages up. And you know, Steve Bannon is a master of propaganda. He can take any defeat and make it look like they're going on the offensive and make it look like it's 5D chess. Well, he said people are getting wobbly about the shutdown. When Bannon is giving bad news and sounding the alarms, you know that MAGA circles are in panic mode. And that's absolutely where they are right now. Everything that has happened in this past year has totally weakened and exposed MAGA to a degree that we never saw in the first term. The Liberation Day tariffs, all this trade war chaos, it's actually only accelerated America's economic decline on the world scale. The wars in Ukraine, Gaza, Iran, Venezuela. His voters see him as just doing the bidding of Zelensky or Netanyahu or folding to the pressure of the neocons. That's breaking apart the coalition. Trump's change of heart about releasing the Jeffrey Epstein files was actually a big factor among his base. In Congress, you know, there's a pending discharge petition to force the government to release all the files related to Jeffrey Epstein. It needs 218 signatures. It's at 217 right now. They're missing one. 6 weeks ago, Arizona elected a Democratic Congresswoman, Adelita Grijalva, who plans to sign the petition. The House GOP, Mike Johnson, the speaker, has denied her access. They're refusing to swear her in. They're saying it's because of the shutdown. So they're kicking the can. The shutdown's not going to last forever. She's going to get sworn in. I mean, these are some of the pressures that are building. We'll see if they release the files. We'll see how that one plays out. The Charlie Kirk assassination was a big event. When it happened, we were looking at this thinking, this could be sort of a game changer. I mean, this could sort of help Trump to bring the culture war issues back to the fore. It could lead to more unity in MAGA. This might cut across this process that we've been analyzing of the falling apart of this coalition. It didn't happen. It actually didn't help Trump's polling at all. Trump's polling has fallen consistently since then. Among Trump's young voters, you see the biggest collapse in support. Voters under 35 who cast a ballot last year for Donald Trump, 30% of them no longer support him. The support among Latinos is down, among all kinds of, all different sections of the population. Farmers are really struggling, in particular the ones that whose crops are affected by this trade war. You know, the tariffs on China have collapsed the soybean market. Farm bankruptcies, not just in soybeans, but in US agriculture, have jumped 57% in the first half of this year. You're seeing an increase in farmer suicides. This is going to have an impact in the Midwestern states and more broadly across the country. There's more misery, there's more economic pain now than there was a year ago. And really than at any point since Trumpism first emerged on the scene 9 years ago. I think this is where we are right now, but there's something else on the horizon, and that is the looming economic meltdown. The US is teetering on the brink of an economic catastrophe, as I said. Over 1 million jobs have been lost since the beginning of the year. Last month alone, in October, you had the most layoffs for a single month since 2003. The most layoffs in a single month in 22 years. The fewest jobs have been added, as I said, since 2009. Comrades have been pointing out how often you're seeing headlines that say, the worst XYZ since 2009 in the headlines. You had the highest number of car repossessions since 2009 this year. It's expected to hit 3 million by the end of the year. People aren't making their car payments. Over 1 million people are 60 days or more delinquent on their auto payments. That's not just the worst since 2009. That's at a higher rate than in the last 3 recessions, going back 25 years. The average FICO credit score has seen its sharpest 2-year decline since 2009. You have a housing slump. The unsold inventory of new houses is at its highest level since 2009. Seasonal retail hiring is at its lowest since 2009. Normally, this is a period where you have all kinds of industries that are boosting up their workforce, getting ready for the holidays. Amazon, you have shipping and logistics, companies like UPS, the retail chains, grocery stores, all bringing on extra staff to get ready. Well, all of those industries are now carrying out mass layoffs instead of boosting. Retail layoffs tripled this year alone. 90,000 retail jobs have been lost. Last week, Amazon announced the biggest round of layoffs in the company's history. And it's not just the 14,000 corporate staff positions that they're axing now. New York Times reported they have plans to do away with up to 600,000 positions in the coming years. Their internal goal is to automate 75% of their operations. This is the second largest private employer in the country. The week before that, UPS announced 48,000 job cuts. That's 10% of their workforce. One of their executives said that automation has allowed them to fulfill the same volume of orders per quarter with 3 million fewer work hours. And so they're shutting down 75 UPS facilities. They're planning to automate 400 more of them. You know that on Liberation Day, Trump brings out these workers in hard hats and in their union gear and uses them as a prop to say, I'm going to do right by the American workers. And this was all a ploy to say, we're going to reshore industry. We're going to bring back high-paid manufacturing jobs. Well, last year, 2024 was a bloodbath for US manufacturing jobs. There was 87,000 manufacturing jobs destroyed. This year has already surpassed that. 89,000 more manufacturing jobs have been destroyed this year. General Motors is laying off thousands of workers at auto plants in Michigan, Ohio, and Tennessee. In May, Nissan announced that it's shutting down 7 auto plants. It's laid off 20,000 workers, also citing Trump's tariffs. The Department of Energy just canceled $700 million in grants to manufacturing of batteries because these projects are not hitting their revenue targets. They're competing with China. Bloomberg recently published an article that was about a group of 8 venture capitalists from the West that did a tour of China, and they saw these manufacturing facilities and these advanced clean energy and clean tech. They came back and says, they're starting to say out loud what they've suspected for a while. China's dominance has left key sectors of the West uninvestable. And that's what's happening to a lot of these. They're just pulling the plug on them. They say, we're never going to catch up, so they're shutting down the projects. As for the energy sector, you know, Trump, before the election, he brought in all these oil tycoons to Mar-a-Lago, said, I need $1 billion from you, and I'm going to unleash America's energy markets as a result. He did, I don't know how much they gave him, but he did give them $18 billion in tax breaks and incentives this summer for oil and gas companies. Well, all the oil companies are downsizing now. They're citing global instability and an uncertain future for their market. Exxon is cutting 2,000 jobs, 4% of its workforce. BP Oil cutting 8,000 workers. Chevron just announced it's cutting 9,000 jobs. That's 20% of its workers. ConocoPhillips is cutting 1 in 4, 20%, 25% of its workforce. And really, none of this even captures the full picture of the scope of the layoffs that are underway. There was a survey of 1,000 businesses conducted, it was published on resume.org.com in September. They found that 1 in 4 companies had had layoffs in 2025. 6 in 10 are planning job cuts next year. The reason for the cuts given, 2/3 say because of uncertainty. 4 in 10 say because of tariffs. 35% say they have falling revenue, and 22% say AI is helping them to replace their workforce. Walmart is the largest private employer in the country. They have over 2 million employees. They've announced a 3-year hiring freeze after laying off 70,000 in the last 5 years. United Health has laid off 30,000 this year. They have a new AI agent called Optum that is now taking half of its calls. Geico Insurance laid off 30,000 as well. Salesforce brought in an AI assistant that replaced 4,000 workers in one swoop. That's 45% of its workforce. Meta has laid off 25,000 in the last 3 years. Microsoft laid off 15,000 this year alone. Intel, you might know, just got bailed out by Trump, who purchased a controlling stock in the company. They're laying off 34,000 this year. That's 20% of its workforce, including thousands of factory jobs. Beyond the tech industry, you also have Starbucks is closing 434 stores. They've laid off 2% of 2,000 corporate positions, rather. Southwest Airlines, 15% of its corporate staff. Target, laying off 8% of its corporate employees. JP Morgan, 10% of its operations workforce. So you see that tech workers are at the front line of fire right now. All told, since the beginning of last year, there have been around 300,000 layoffs of workers in the tech industry. Now, this is an ongoing process. The question is, like, at what point you reach a tipping point and things really take off and grab that next gear. But the Washington Post said this week, employers cited cost-cutting and artificial intelligence as the top 2 reasons for job reductions in October. There's a wide variety of estimates as to how much AI is driving these layoffs. I mean, last month, Bernie Sanders came out with a report that said the US could lose up to 100 million jobs in the next decade. That would mean, 6 out of 10 workers unemployed by the mid-2030s. Now, they use ChatGPT for that calculation, so take it with a grain of salt. A more conservative estimate from Goldman Sachs says it's more like 10 million jobs. If that's on the safe side, that's also not a very bright prediction for Trump's hopes for building this great golden age. The World Economic Forum said earlier this year that 41% of corporations are planning to reduce workforce with AI. That survey of businesses I mentioned earlier from September said 1 in 4 businesses are planning to use AI to replace their workers next year as well. Axios published this, and they said, we've talked to scores of CEOs at companies of various sizes and across many industries. Every single one of them is working furiously to figure out when and how agents or other AI technology can displace human workers at scale. The second these technologies can operate at a human efficiency level, which could be 6 months to several years from now, companies will shift from humans to machines. This could wipe out tens of millions of jobs in a very short period of time. By all appearances, we're talking about something that's building up slowly. I don't know how close on the horizon this kind of thing is, but if it reaches that tipping point, then you could have a real jobs bloodbath become a reality. Jamie Dimon has said, you can't just take people who are earning 6 figures and throw them out on the streets where their next job is going to be $30,000 a year. You'll have a revolution. Those are Jamie Dimon's words. Now, we also don't know if this is going to happen on Trump's watch. Right now, it's not looking good for him. But after all of these, after promising the sun and the moon to the angry workers of this country, there's also another type of economic tipping point on the horizon as well. In addition to the question of AI and automation and the general decline in the jobs market, a comrade yesterday mentioned that tech companies have accounted for 80% of this year's stock market gains. The US economy is almost entirely propped up by an unprecedented tech bubble that is waiting to burst. One Harvard economist found that tech spending accounted for 92% of GDP growth in the first half of this year. That if you had removed tech spending from the economy, you would have had 0.1% growth of GDP. Tech companies are on track to spend $400 billion this year alone on the AI build-out. That's more than was spent over a decade for the Apollo program. It's more than was spent on the entire Marshall Aid program to rebuild Europe. after World War II. They're spending that not every 10 years, but every 10 months. They've also found that 95% of AI generative pilot program companies are unprofitable. So there's a lot of circular finance going. One JP Morgan analyst said Oracle stock jumped 25% after being promised $60 billion a year from OpenAI, an amount of money that OpenAI doesn't earn yet, to provide cloud computing facilities that Oracle hasn't built yet, which will require 4.5 gigawatts of power, the equivalent of 4 nuclear plants, which the United States hasn't built yet. So this is the valuation, this is the relationship between where the economy is at and where these valuations on the stock market are at. We've looked at this valuation, stock price to real earnings ratio, which typically fluctuates between 10 to 20 points. Right now, well, at the dot-com bubble, it reached 44. Right now, it's at 40. It's already higher than it was in 1929, and some companies are exceeding it by massive margins. NVIDIA, the last numbers I have, had a valuation 60 times its earnings. Tesla, 240 times. Palantir, 700 times. The phenomenon called margin borrowing, where investors borrow money simply to go and speculate it on the stock market, is a sign of a frothy bubble. This has increased 32% in the last 5 months leading up to September. Now, this is the way that the former chief economist of the IMF, Geeta Gopinath, analyzed the current situation. She says, I calculate that a market correction of the same magnitude as the dot-com crash could wipe out over $20 trillion in wealth for American households, equivalent to roughly 70% of American GDP in 2024. This is several times larger than the losses incurred during the crash of the early 2000s. The global fallout would be similarly severe. Foreign investors could face wealth losses exceeding $15 trillion, or about 20% of the rest of the world's GDP. We're talking about a scenario where $35 trillion are wiped out because of this bubble popping. What that would mean, comrades, is kind of hard for us to imagine. The misery we've seen around the government shutdown, take that and multiply it times 100. The pictures of people lining up for hours at these food banks, I mean, we really haven't, this hasn't sunk in yet for the working class. It has not sunk in for the mass of the population what this could mean. A lot of young people, they're pessimistic about their futures. We've seen that in polls, but it's not a pessimism that is looking into the face of like a coming catastrophe. There was one poll that found earlier on this year, 50% of young people, only half, are still confident that they're going to acquire a house and achieve financial security. But still, that's half of them. 33% still think they're going to acquire significant wealth. What happens when you take millions of people and they realize after all of these struggles, I'm not going to come through the other end and have like stability and a home and like financial security waiting for me? What is that going to do to mass consciousness? Is the question. These are questions that the US hasn't faced since the Great Depression. I mean, we saw the effects of 2008. That wiped out 10 million people lost their homes. Something like 9 or 10 million people lost their jobs. Food banks right now are overwhelmed. Right now, people are lining up in the Bronx starting at 4 a.m. in the morning. And after doors open from the food banks, they're closing within like 2 hours. This is not normal in the United States. The US working class is not used to these kinds of conditions. That's why it's shocking when you see these lines. You know, you see footage on social media. But what happens when it becomes commonplace? You know, we also know what mass homelessness looks like. Last year, there was 1.5 million people who slept on the streets or at a homeless shelter at some point across the whole year. At the height of the Great Depression, it reached 2 million people. But what happens when homelessness spikes by the millions in a sudden way? I mean, I was talking to comrades about the Great Depression and looking at images of these shanty towns that propped up in Central Park. These are workers that are like, they're well dressed. They're not like, they haven't been homeless for a long time. It's a sudden change in people's lives. Comrades are talking about these dystopian scenes you see in LA when you're driving past Skid Row. Tens of thousands of homeless people on the street, and then there's like autonomous Waymo vehicles coming by and little robots delivering food at the same time. Some of these tech workers that have been laid off after 20 years working at Microsoft are struggling to land an interview, and when they do, it's a 10-minute like AI chat conversation. The scenario where this really hits the fan is something that the capitalists have tried to prevent for a long time. They've kicked the can for many years, but eventually there is going to be an avalanche, and it's going to be ugly. And at that point, our task is to explain that this is not just a question of policy, of Trump. This is not going to be solved by getting the Democrats back in. This is a question of where capitalism is within its lifespan, where this mode of production is at. Because everything they did to try to avert this when it first sprung up in 2008 has only made the situation worse. And when it eventually does have this avalanche, it's going to be the accumulation of all of these contradictions. You know, we've often explained that the American dream wasn't just a lie, it wasn't just an illusion, it did have a material basis. And that was that 3-decade period emerging out of World War II, where you had a growth rate of the world economy that was like triple what it is today. And the US accounted for half of that. The fact that the US has seen its share cut in half and the growth rate has fallen from like 6% a year to 2% or less a year, that is the dilemma that Trump is unable to solve, that the Democrats are unable to solve. The ruling class has no way to turn this around. That's the exhaustion of the capitalist system. Now, there was, obviously, the post-war boom was an anomaly. That was a special period. It's not going to be repeated. But there was a second lease of life for the system in the 1990s. It was brought about by the collapse of the Soviet Union, the restoration of capitalism in China, the liberalization of India. All told, you brought like 2 billion people into the world market. That's more workers, more consumers, an expansion of the market. And so you've had this period of globalization. Now that is coming to an end. When you have the end of globalization, you're seeing the end of that final frontier of expansion. And that spells ruin for world capitalism, because the capitalists of the world are looking on the horizon. They're saying, we're not seeing an expansion of the market tomorrow. Why would we invest in production and building more capacity when we're already totally saturated? There is no drive. The basic mechanism that drove capitalism forward is coming to a grinding halt. Even in China and in the BRICS, in the countries where you do see a higher rate of growth, you're seeing it come against the limits of the world market. These venture capitalists that did that tour in China, they said, you know, China had this model called 996. It meant workers have a standard of working from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. 6 days a week. They said that may have been officially banned. That's still the norm in a lot of these industries, and that's the way China has been squeezing out so much surplus value from its own workers. The world market is now flooded, and you have huge debt. I mean, this is the other result. Along with everything we're saying, the ruling class has tried so far to address the situation by massively expanding debt. That's been their only solution. As the growth rates have slowed, in lockstep with that process, they're adding more and more debt to try and keep the system going. It's a way of artificially expanding the limits of the system beyond its natural limits. So people can't afford a house and a car, okay, give them a credit card and then let them just accumulate debt over many years. The businesses can't invest, they're not finding it profitable because the world market is shrinking, okay, let them take out loans and they'll just keep things going based on accumulating debt. This has reached a point where US capitalism, world capitalism, but especially the US, is completely addicted to debt. There's no way for them to operate without it. What you have now is a situation of these zombie companies where 4 in 10 publicly traded companies doesn't generate enough revenue to pay the interest on its debt. So the only way that they can continue operating is to take on more and more debt. That's 4 in 10 publicly traded companies in the US. That's an incredible amount that's artificially being kept alive. The total US debt was around 1.5 trillion in the early 1970s. It surpassed 50 trillion in 2008. It's since doubled again since 2008 to 104 trillion today. That's like nearly 100-fold growth of debt in the last 50 years. And for households, it's reached an all-time high, 18.2 trillion. This is affecting 8 out of 10 US households. Everyone is drowning in debt. The whole system is drowning in debt. You have also the question of public debt. You might know that Trump, in his first term, didn't give much worry to the question of debt. And he was criticized by a lot of the long-term, like the serious strategists of the bourgeois, saying this is irresponsible. We need responsible government that does something about getting this debt. Well, finally, the problem has caught up to him. He increased it by 7.8 trillion in his first term. I think they've reached the point where you're going to have the introduction of MAGA austerity because they cannot continue to kick the can without having the interest rate spike. And the entire cost is now, they're paying as much on interest as they are in the entire military. The United States can't afford to pay one military, two militaries, three militaries, the biggest line item on its agenda. So you have, in reality, this is one of the guiding motivations behind Project 2025 and the big, beautiful bill. They're trying to slash and cut down on expenses, slash the federal staff budget, cancel or suspend these expensive infrastructure projects like the Hudson Tunnel, the Hudson River Tunnel that they're building, the Second Avenue subway, $18 billion that have been frozen by the federal government. They're citing DEI as the reason for that. They've, this need to cut the healthcare access or to increase the premiums for 20 million people. So by some estimates, it's going to double for 20 million people, or to cut tens of million people off Medicaid. This is austerity. This is what they're trying to achieve with it. The cuts to the energy grants, to all these other projects like the battery manufacturing, withholding the funding to universities, forcing these large settlements. Doge was trying to cut 80,000 Veterans Administration jobs. That provoked a big backlash, so they backed off. Now they're just going to cut 30,000 from the VA. Whether Trump decides to withhold federal funding from New York City is another question. But a lot of what his guiding principle is, they're trying to get a hold of this debt and the deficit. Even this tariff revenue, Trump boasts about how much money the federal government is generating from the tariffs. This is money that's coming from U.S. consumer pockets. The cost that's being paid by the importers is being passed on to U.S. consumers in higher prices. So in effect, we're all paying this regressive tax as consumers and as the working class. If they have to end up resorting to another round of 2008 style bailouts or something bigger, then you can just imagine what this pressure on austerity for Trump is going to be magnified tenfold. This is all part of understanding where Trumpism is going, where the U.S. is going and where world capitalism is going, because they have no way to avoid these kinds of catastrophes. It's really a question of time. We don't have a way to tell how close this is, but the ruling class doesn't back Trump. They're not happy with the leadership that he's provided for dealing with this problem, and they have bigger problems than just the domestic economy. They're managing America's decline on the global stage, and they have a really erratic, irrational, unpredictable captain at the helm of the ship. And the ruling class does not have faith or trust in the way that Trump is going to handle it. The war with Ukraine has completely exposed NATO's weakness. And what Trump is doing so far is taking all the alliances, all the former friends of the United States are now being subordinated to the position of vassals. They can be turned into pain sponges and absorb the shocks of this decline. Europe is headed for catastrophe. As comrades, we discussed in the session on Greece. Greece in the 2010s really was a preview for the rest of Europe in the 2020s. And they're in a predicament that they cannot solve because you have these 40 countries, 27 of them in the EU. Some of the biggest economies are on the verge of bankruptcy now. They're on the brink of default. And they're all divided. They don't have a single ruling class or a single national priority or sphere of influence. And they don't have a single military force. And so they have no way, and because they don't have a single capital market, they have no way of investing the sufficient amounts to get in on these advanced manufacturing, any of these really critical strategic races between the US and China, AI, chips, rare earths, renewables. So they're stuck between these two blocks. And meanwhile, the rivals of the United States, the BRICS, if you take by purchasing power parity, these are not small countries that are just banding up together to defeat the bully. These are giants. China, by purchasing power parity, is now 33% larger than the US. US is in second place in the world, but that's followed by India, and then Russia. Russia is ahead of Japan and Germany. And the growth rate in the OECD has been one of stagnation. We see that even those growth rates in the BRICS is also slowing down. Now, Trump wanted to pull out of all of these areas, but as we discussed yesterday, he's finding that very difficult to do. You can't just pull out of a sphere of influence without ceding that territory to the other bloc. And that's what he's finding. Some comrades have asked, why doesn't he just turn on Netanyahu? But he's unwilling to give up that, for one, the only reliable US outpost in that oil-rich region. But for two, Iran would be left as the dominant power in the region. And Iran is part of BRICS. It's armed by Russia. It's backed by China. It's part of this. So he would basically be pulling out and ceding that territory to the other bloc. It means it's not so easy for him to retrench. And so instead of this America First policy that a lot of the MAGA voters had hoped for, instead of him stopping the interventions around the world, he's actually playing more of a bullying, imperialist, interventionist role that he did in his first term. The irony is that he broke with people like John Bolton in his first term, who were pushing for this hawkish neocon intervention around the world, and now he's carrying out John Bolton's policy as far as Venezuela goes. We don't know what's actually going to happen with Venezuela. You've had this huge buildup. It seems like it's been, as we discussed yesterday, this a pressure for Maduro to step down. So far, Maduro has given no indication that he plans to step down, and Trump may be forced to back down, in part because Maduro is not just in this conflict alone. The Russians have a strategic partnership with Venezuela. This goes back to 2018, when Russia dispatched long-range interballistic, rather strategic bombers to Venezuela as a show of support. Well, they've just signed a new strategic partnership. It's an energy partnership, an arms partnership, a trade partnership. Russia provides a lot of arms for Venezuela already. They're buying Venezuelan oil. And the Russian Foreign Ministry has denounced the US military aggression against Venezuela. This is from one of the high-ranking officials, the deputy chairman of the Russian State Duma Defense Committee, acknowledged that this transport aircraft, the Ilyushin IL-76, did deliver air defense systems, Pantsir SI and Buk M2 air defense systems to Venezuela. These are used frequently in Ukraine. And so it's kind of remarkable that as the Russians are closing in on Pakrovsk, they apparently, while the West has its arms depleted, the Russians apparently have defense systems to spare in Venezuela. The same official said that Russia could deploy the Oreshnik ballistic missile or Caliber cruise missiles to Venezuela as a response to Western pressure. They're leaving that on the table. So we don't know how Trump is going to respond. I don't know if he himself knows, but this USS Gerald Ford, the largest aircraft carrier in the world that has been ordered to return from the Mediterranean to the Caribbean, has been parked for, I think, 5 days now off the coast of Morocco. It could be a sign that Trump is having second thoughts. But even if he gets the regime change he wants, if that scenario I think is closing now, but that collapse of that government could be a very messy situation, and it could pull the US into more involvement than what Trump actually wants. And with those anti-imperialist sentiments in Latin America running so deep, Trump's playing with fire. He's playing with fire abroad and at home. I think these scenes that we've seen, the atmosphere in Chicago with the ICE raids, it's not intimidating people as much as it's enraging people. And you see the mood for a fight back that's brewing. I think the point of all this, comrades, is that we're still in the calm before the storm. As much as we're in a turbulent situation, we have been for a while. You listen to Against the Stream every week, and the comrades always, Hamid at the beginning is always like, we've had another week where decades happen. And then the next week is the same, and this is the pace of history now. But these events are going to lead to an acceleration in the changes in mass consciousness. It's already underway. And we've talked a little bit about the way that the working class learns through successive approximation. That means it's not in a straight line, like an individual gradual march towards more communism, more class conscious, more. That's not the way that it's going to go. The working class tests out different political forces, and they have to see in practice, okay, this worked, this didn't work, this disappointed. This is the way that the working class learns. And so if you think about the changes that we've looked at in mass consciousness in the United States, really Trumpism is a result of the school of the Democrats, starting with Obama in 2008. That period gave rise to the MAGA era. And now we've had the school of Trumpism. That's a school that the US working class in the world has seen for 9 years now. And you have this coming disappointment. We'll see the scale of that, but it's already starting to usher in a new phase. This rise of reformism, this is actually something that the US working class hasn't had a real taste of for generations. I don't know when's the last time you could say that you had an option like this, even on the general ballot. It was off the menu in 2016 because Bernie capitulated to Hillary and wasn't willing to fight back against the DNC. Same thing happened in 2020. In part, you could say they met in the middle. Zoran moved to the right, obviously. That's something that we've seen sharply since over the last 9 months. But at the same time, the Democratic Party is so weak, so discredited, so hated, that it was unable to clamp down and crush Zoran's campaign as some of the leadership of that party would have liked to have done. Think about what kind of opposition was provided by Cuomo. I mean, in some ways, it's like a parody. You could hardly design a more off-putting, unpopular, uncharismatic figure. That some of the ads I remember watching were like, they would take someone that spoke like a working class person and say, you might not like Cuomo, you might not agree with any of his proposals, but at least he knows what he's doing. All of the attacks against Zoran were about how inexperienced he was and how unconnected from the establishment he was. And I remember that you had all those candidates on the one of the debates before the primary, where they had all these candidates lined up, and they said, where's your first international visit going to be as mayor? One after another, they said, I'm going to go to Israel. And I too will travel to Israel. And the next one, I'm going to go to Israel for the 5th time. And then Zoran says, well, I'm running for the mayor of New York. I plan to stay right here and focus on affordability. And then I remember people talking about that moment in a bar afterwards. I mean, this had a big, by the way, 2/3 of voters said that candidates' views on Israel was a factor in their vote. And 1/3 of Jewish New Yorkers voted for Mamdani. I mean, it tells you something about the changing public opinion toward Israel and the lowering political influence of Zionism, particularly among the youth. But above all, of course, this was about the economic anger that we began with, this cost of living, people spending more than half of their income on rent, struggling to survive, feeling the sense of frustration and desperation, which was produced Trump, you know, a swing towards Trump that was seen a year ago. It's the same thing that produced this flip for Mamdani in many parts of New York City. Other elections, by the way, where the Democrats won, exit polls said the same thing, that the economic discontent is the main issue that's motivating voters to go to the polls. Now, after everything we've laid out about what's on the horizon for the US economy, what's going to happen to this mood of frustration, of anger and discontent over the economy, over the cost of living? It's not going away, comrades. It's going to build. And it's, you know, at this moment, you see this intense enthusiasm. There's a euphoria among Zoran voters, not just among those working class voters who are hoping that their lives are going to get a little bit better. There's also this layer of radicalized youth, that 500,000 New Yorkers who call themselves democratic socialists. Many of them are hoping that Zoran is going to go further. When we talk to them about revolutionary ideas, there is no wall, there's no rejection, there's no pushback. I don't think we've once found a young person who's a Zoran fan who doesn't agree with all the proposals that we're putting forward when we say we need to take this much further. There's huge enthusiasm for that. And it was the same with Bernie, actually. You know, a lot of people found their way to communism through the experience of Bernie Sanders. In the beginning, there was massive enthusiasm. Then there was massive disappointment. All of that was part of the process, the learning experience that brought people to draw conclusions. You've now seen this, the sea change in public opinion in the last period, not because of how effective our propaganda has been, or any other socialist or communist organization making the case for this. It's a result of life under the system. It's the experience of the Democratic Party in power, the school of the Democrats, starting with 2008 and Obama's term. Now, obviously, this, what has been called populism on the right and on the left, it's distorted, it's confused, it's ambiguous, but it's a rejection of the establishment and the ruling institutions, and it's still evolving. What we're saying is this process hasn't arrived at its destination yet. Where is it going to go in the next period after the school of Zoran, the school of reformism? A school that might be taking place, tested within the worst, the most severe capitalist decline that we've seen in, since the Great Depression, possibly. The role of communists is to go through this experience together with that vast layer that is looking for a way forward, help them to draw conclusions. In addition to all those voters of Mamdani who call themselves democratic socialists, it's interesting that nearly 1 in 10 of them, over 100,000 people, voted for Mamdani after voting for Trump last year. we got to think about how we help this process forward. We don't do it by hiding our ideas. I mean, we have our criticisms. We said it was a mistake to run as a Democrat. We believe that's going to be borne out by events in the coming period. But we don't stand on the sidelines and say, Mamdani is going to betray you. He's a Democrat. He's a class enemy. At this time when there's mass enthusiasm, we didn't say that when Bernie Sanders was running in 2016. We had this open, friendly dialogue, and we helped people. We explained what is it going to take to actually break the resistance of the billionaires, the bankers, and the landlords. Not negotiations and backroom deals with the billionaires. It's not going to achieve anything. Not taking the phone calls with Obama. Not filling your transition team with all of these veterans from the last 3 mayoral administrations. He's chosen people that were part of Michael Bloomberg, Eric Adams, and Bill de Blasio's transition team. He's bringing on Lena Khan, the chair of the Federal Trade Commission under Joe Biden. Maria Torres Springer was Eric Adams' first deputy mayor. Ilana Leopold was the political strategist for de Blasio. She's going to be the team's executive director. Grace Bonilla, the CEO of United Way, a nonprofit fundraiser that works with all these Fortune 500 CEOs. This is not the way to start. It would have been a better sign if he had filled it with brand new, unexperienced DSA people and started in with that way. But the point is, we have to be able to explain in positive terms, not just with critiques. Let's say, look, Zoran won 6 out of 10 renters in the city. Now, from what I know about DSA's local campaigns, they like to fight for tenants. Why not organize all of those tenants into one massive tenants union citywide and get all of these renters on board and lean on that force? Not leaning on the real estate developers, not paying tribute to the importance of the private sector and talking to the real estate companies, but lean on the tenants themselves. Or the MTA, it's governed partially by New York State, which means he's going to have to make a deal with Hochul, who's already said she's not going to raise taxes. Instead of dealing with Hochul, who, by the way, last month, when there was the threat of a strike of the Long Island Railroad workers, called on Trump and said, Trump, the federal government should step in and make these workers, tell them they're not allowed to strike. That was Hochul's position. Now Mamdani is going to team up with her in order to make MTA affordable. Why not go and organize cells among the MTA workers directly? You know that you don't have to wait until next year after all of this negotiation to have free buses. You know that MTA workers can take a plastic bag, put it over the thing where you pack. Free buses starting today. Come on board. They have it in their power. The New York City Labor Council has over 1 million members. Why not mobilize them as your base and say, we're going to start a campaign to organize every last worker in this city who wants to join a union. We're going to organize the unorganized, including the undocumented workers. Starting with the grocery workers. If you want to have this grocery pilot program, instead of having a subsidized thing that's going to trim a little bit off the margin, what you need is to organize the workers in each of these and then call for the expropriation of the entire retail chain, the distributors, the suppliers, the warehouses, the entire supply line. That is where you're going to be able to bring down the cost of groceries and unify it all into a single system. Obviously, comrades, any step in this direction would have to be backed up by mass strikes, mobilizations. I mean, a program for expropriating the landlords is a serious thing. You're not going to do this without a massive struggle in the streets. And I think this is the perspective that we need to lay out for people. Not only is all of this possible, this is the wealthiest city in the wealthiest country on the planet. Of course it's possible in New York City. There are the same number of homeless people as there are millionaires in this city. As far as the rent-stabilized apartments, there's 50,000 of them that are vacant, just the rent-stabilized ones. I think what's required is we explain to people in a concrete way what it means to break with the limits of capitalism. In the manifesto, it says that the communists are the most advanced and resolute section of the working class parties of every country. That section that pushes forward all the others. Our theory gives us the advantage of clearly understanding the general lines of march, the conditions, the ultimate general results of the proletarian movement. The communists fight for the attainment of the immediate aims, for the enforcement of the momentary interests of the working class, but in the moment of the present, they represent and take care of the future of that movement. Now, in practice, this means that we need to see all of this is part of an evolving process. Where is this going to lead tomorrow, the next year? And not get caught up or fixated or overwhelmed by where it is right now, but anticipate how it's going to change tomorrow. The disappointment under the Democrats produced Bernie Sanders and MAGA. It's ushering now in the school of Zoran Mamdani. If he fails to break with the Democrats, if he continues down this path of class collaboration, it is going to produce something else. Where will that disappointment go? The result of all this, comrades, is that the stage is being set for an era of mass revolutionary communist politics. You think our ideas land now? Wait until you see the way they land in the 2030s. What we need to do is to continue to build our forces systematically, patiently, persistently, overcoming every obstacle and strengthening our party. And if we do this, history is going to offer us an opportunity, the opportunity of a century, and we're going to be able to seize it, comrades.